Simone Stolzoff, welcome to the show. How you doing?
Doing well. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thanks for coming out. I know you're based up in San Francisco.
I am. Californian West Coast vibes.
I love it. I love it. Just a quick flight up north. Well, I'm excited to dive into the topic of your new book, How to Not Know. We live in tumultuous times. Uncertainty is sort of it's baked into the daily experience, almost like the hourly experience, I would say, today.
Yeah, I mean, there's two things going on. One is the world feels more uncertain than ever. You think about war and COVID and tariff policy. But the other thing that's going on is that our tolerance for uncertainty is in decline. So for years, the growth of the internet and mobile phones have created the expectation that answers should be readily available. But they've also robbed us of the practice of sitting with what we don't know. There's some really interesting research that shows that with the rise of mobile phones, you get a pretty precipitous decline of people's willingness to tolerate what they don't know. You
Why
might
is that?
think about this yourself. You know, maybe 10 years ago, you might have been okay not knowing the name of like a given actor. And now I feel like an almost involuntary need to reach into my pocket. I think there's two things going on. One is there's this expectation that answers should be readily available, that every big question in our life should be able to be Googleable or ChatGPTable. And the other thing it does is it condenses all of the world's problems, all of the anxieties or uncertainties that might have otherwise been out of sight, out of mind, and brings it to our pocket. I think about this in terms of parenting. Now we can track our kids' every move with our phones, but this access to limitless information has only fueled our anxiety. So the world is more uncertain, our tolerance for uncertainty is in decline, and that's what brings us here today.
Oh my God. Wow. That's a fascinating take on this dilemma. But wouldn't you say it's ultimately like, well, is it a net positive that we have more information than ever before at our fingertips 24/7?
Yeah, I definitely think it's empowering. It allows, people to start businesses on their own, especially with the rise of AI. You can get personalized responses to your questions. But there's a difference between something being productive and something being at expense of our anxiety or our mental health. And I think the intolerance of uncertainty has a lot of negative consequences, whether it's rumination or worry or fear about the future. This instability is not necessarily new. If you were living in Florence during the bubonic plague or a hand loom weaver in the Industrial Revolution, you might not think of modern day uncertainty as being a big deal. But I think it is this rise of the internet and phones that has made the uncertainty particularly hard to tolerate.
Is it a solvable problem?
No, I mean, uncertainty is an inevitable part of life. And for a minute, just imagine the alternative. What if everything was certain? What if we were all sort of in a conveyor belt going toward a known destination? No movie would come without a spoiler. No first date would ever have the butterflies of maybe so. But there's a balance between seeing opportunity as a threat versus seeing opportunity as the birthplace of possibility, for example. And if you're able to approach uncertainty with more curiosity than fear, you can learn how to wield it to your advantage, as opposed to it constantly being a source of anxiety or stress.
Wow. So how do we wield it to our advantage? I mean, is there something that high performers, is there a way that high performers handle uncertainty that maybe, lower tier performers don't?
Yeah, I think the first is just the willingness to persist in spite of uncertainty. So you think about a revolutionary artist, for example. If you get to a point where you're creating a piece of music or painting that you've never created before, and you listen to that discomfort, that feeling of, oh, I've never been here before, I'm scared, it might make you revert to something that feels, duplicative of something that already exists, going back to like a safe place. Whereas if you're able to be more comfortable with the uncertainty, you can persist and create something that's net new. No world-changing piece of art or breakthrough scientific discovery or generational business has come without someone's willingness to get to a point where they didn't know and to keep going. But it requires a tolerance. It requires an ability to keep going in spite of that uncertainty. I think there's a good analogy from the sports world. There's this great study out of a university in Germany that found that high-performing athletes and non-high-performing athletes have the same pain threshold, the moment where they experience pain, but the highest performers have a higher pain tolerance, which is to say that they're able to exist in that painful place for a longer period of time. And I think similarly, our uncertainty tolerance is a muscle that we're able to build over time. Through exposure to uncertainty, we can build the confidence and conviction to keep going in spite of not knowing where you might end up.
Wow. It's super interesting. Does social media exploit our addiction to certainty?
Yeah, I mean, especially in the space that you're so familiar with in health and wellness, I think there is this addiction to certainty, that wanting to know the panacea, the silver bullet, the definitive answer. Especially imagine like the early days of the pandemic, there was so much grasping for, if we only take this one magical pill or have this one protocol, all of your life's problems will be solved. When in actuality, health is a complex tableau full of many different variables. And it's actually our ability to not grasp for those easy answers or subscribe just to the hot takes that allows us to think about it more holistically, where we can think about our health over a longer time horizon.
The hot takes, they're soothing in a way because they present the illusion of certainty.
Of course.
Like a certain, cure or therapy, treatment, or what have you, when the answers to modern health ills are typically more complex than a single like silver bullet approach.
Totally. Especially in today's day and age, we all want to know exactly who's going to win the election, or subscribe to someone that will predict exactly when the market is going to crash, or tell you the protocol that'll help your microbiome before anyone else knows. But the foundation for that is our wiring, our biology. You think about our prehistoric ancestors. If there was like a rustling in the bushes and they didn't know the source of that rustling, then it would cause them to be incredibly uncomfortable. But if they knew, that certainty was comforting. It's the same reason why we like music that's based on repeating patterns. When we can predict what is to come, it makes us feel safe and secure. The problem is we're taking that prehistoric brain that equates certainty with safety and security and applying it to so many different aspects of our life, even when that certainty isn't available.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, how does that apply to, it's not wellness related per se, but I mean, the markets today. I've been seeing a lot of people, maybe it's just my X algorithm, but people are talking about how to approach the current volatility in the stock market. We're seeing like historic dips now in tech when economic indicators are all like in the green, right? Or black. Is that what the financial way to, I don't know. But yeah, I mean, like tech is incredibly exciting. I think that we're in the midst of this revolutionary time, but there's also many people are saying like really like great opportunities now if you can only weather the uncertainty.
Yeah, I mean, it's the foundation of a mismatch in the market. I talked to a bunch of venture capitalists for this book, and one of the things that really stuck out to me is that they said in the best deals, there's almost never consensus. Because if everyone agrees that it's a great deal, it's probably already baked into the price. But on the best deals, the best companies worth investing in, it requires you to go out on a limb a little bit, to take a risk, to make a bet without knowing exactly how it's going to turn out. The problem is that when you are trying to beat the market or pick individual stocks over the longer time horizon, you will almost always lose money, except for the very select few. And so one thing that I keep in mind is that even the experts, so think about people like economists or politicians or journalists, their predictions about the future are wrong the majority of the time. There was this academic named Phil Tetlock who compiled predictions from the smartest people in the world over the course of a decade. And his canonical finding in this book, Super Forecasters, was that the average expert was roughly as accurate as a dart-throwing chimpanzee. So these are the best people in the world. And you see this when you watch sports. Everyone's trying to predict who's going to win the game or exactly who's going to win the election. And there's never accountability for when you're wrong. But every so often you get someone who made a great bet on X and they become a celebrity. And so I think the same principles apply, going back to diversifying your portfolio, whether it's the portfolio of your stocks or the portfolio of your identity. That's a great way to hedge against uncertainty, to have multiple parts of your life that define you, so that if one foundation of your identity were to crumble, like for example, a big tech job during the pandemic, your whole identity won't collapse. Another thing that I would think about is how can you find the anchors that will remain constant amidst all of the changing winds? And so one of the great insights that I learned through the reporting for this book is that when we're certain about some aspects of our life, it makes it easier to hold uncertainty in others. So on a personal level, that might be your values, or where you know that you want to live, or your partner, who you want to live with. And having those anchors in your life makes it easier to maybe hold some of the uncertainty about geopolitics or the economy or politics when you aren't exactly sure what is to come.
So we have like a baseline necessity for a certain level of stability in our lives, and once we've procured that, then it gives us a little bit more freedom to productively handle certainty in other domains.
Yeah, I mean, you think about our brain's natural tendency to catastrophize when we're faced with an uncertain situation. It's really easy to think about all of the things that can go wrong. You know, maybe you can think about a time where you've gone through a breakup, or maybe you've lost a job. It's really easy to think, oh, my life is over. Things are never going to be the same again. And the fact is, we're really bad at predicting how future events might impact our well-being. So there's this great parable that I really like about this Chinese farmer. And one day, the horse that he has his livelihood around runs away from the small village in which he lives. And his neighbors all come to his door, and the neighbors say, "Oh, we're so sorry to hear about your horse. What a tragedy." And the farmer says, "Maybe yes, maybe no." Next day, the horse comes back, and with it, 8 other wild horses behind it. And the neighbors come to his door, and they say, "We're so grateful to hear about all of these horses. You're so lucky." And the farmer says, "Maybe yes, maybe no." The day after, the farmer's son is riding one of the wild horses and falls off the horse and breaks his leg. And again, the neighbors say, "We're so sorry. What a tragedy. What a bummer." And the farmer says, "Maybe yes, maybe no." The day after, generals from the Chinese military come by the village to conscript people into the army, to draft people for a war. And because the son has broken his leg, he gets out of the war. The neighbors say, "You're so lucky." The farmer says,
"Maybe yes, maybe no."
And so I think that is a much more healthy and resilient way to approach the events of our life, rather than thinking, a layoff or a breakup is going to be necessarily a tragedy. We're often discounting our ability to course correct the other possibilities that might sit on the other side of that initial discomfort.
So would you say that is it fair to say that high performers, high net worth individuals, maybe even now in the context of the tumult in the stock market, see periods of maybe higher levels, higher degrees of uncertainty as opportunities?
Yeah, the research shows that there are more startups that are founded in economic downturns. There's a quote from the musician Brian Eno that I think about a lot, where he says, "I want to make music unlike any music that I've ever heard." And that is the desire to face uncertainty, the desire not to see uncertainty as a threat, but uncertainty as where the genius can arise. And I think that is what separates high performers, people with high net worth, people that have been successful in their life, is not necessarily discounting uncertainty, but being able to say, okay, I don't know exactly where I end up. I don't know exactly where this will go, but I'm able to put one foot in front of the other and continue to move forward.
It reminds me of that iconic quote from Game of Thrones by Peter Baelish, Littlefinger. Did you watch Game of Thrones? Mm-hmm. He, I forget the character he's talking to, but he goes, "Chaos isn't a pit. Chaos is a ladder." Mm. And I think it's such a great way to think about these crazy times. So is now a good time to buy? Like, would you say maybe not individual stocks, which are a little bit more chaotic over the long term, but like one of these like index funds or something like that? Like, the people want to know.
Yeah, well, I'm not going to give individual stock advice on the podcast. I'm by no means a financial professional, but I do think that there are opportunities that arise from chaotic or uncertain periods that are unique to potentially exploit or potentially take advantage of. So instead of just holding up or having that fear of the unknown get you to say, take all of your money out of the market, those who are able to remain consistent, who are able to weather some of the precarity or the uncertainty of the market, tend to perform better over a longer time horizon.
It really tests your mettle more than like your gut, like more than anything else. Like it's a visceral, like emotional thing, more so than I think like an intellectual or even financial one.
Yeah, I mean, I think it requires some level of faith, and sometimes we think about faith as being this sort of woo-woo or spiritual thing. But if you have the conviction to make a bet, that is the only way that you can reap what you sow. That is the only way that you can find what might lie on the other side of that risk. I know you've had some other guests on the pod who've talked about, say, the other side of hard, for example. And I think that is really what separates people who are able to have outsized success or outside wins in their life, is they don't shy away from the discomfort. They're able to see that there might be opportunity that lies on the other side.
What about the mental health toll? Like, can uncertainty lead to feelings of anxiety, depression?
Very much so. Yeah, I interviewed this guy named Michael Dugas for the book, who is the leading psychologist, who shows that underlying a lot of the anxiety and mental health disorders that we're all faced with today in our society, there is a fundamental intolerance of uncertainty. And so Dugas treats uncertainty like any other phobia, which is to say that the best way to get over it is through exposure. So if you were terrified of spiders, for example, maybe you'd start by researching some interesting facts about spiders, or looking at a picture of a spider, or being in the same room as a spider, but 20 feet away before you start touching the spider head on. Similarly, you can develop more tolerance for uncertainty through exposure to uncertainty. You can think back on your life of previous periods where you might not have known what you were doing or where you were going. You can do things like trying a new restaurant or taking a new route to work that is sort of like microdosing uncertainty, but it actually rewires your brain to be more capable of tolerating uncertainty in bigger ways later in your life. I know that you talk about this a little bit in terms of the connection between physical and mental health, where if you're able to take positive steps for your physical health, it can have really strong effects for your mental health. And there's that sort of cross-pollination where you think of them as separate things, but actually they're all feeding the same whole.
Yeah, there's a cross-adaptation effect that occurs when we subject our bodies to physical stress. There's sort of a mental resilience that is simultaneously cultivated, which isn't exactly intuitive, because we're stimulating our bodies in a way to adapt and to grow stronger, but it seems to reward mental health and resilience at the same time, which is super interesting.
Yeah, the research shows that individuals with higher levels of uncertainty tolerance tend to be more creative and more innovative because they're willing to tolerate the type of risk that leads to breakthroughs. Same is true for communities. They tend to be more resilient and adaptive because they're able to cross some of those cultural differences that might keep people from connecting. And for organizations as well, a lot of the most innovative companies in the world started with people's willingness to take a risk or to face uncertainty and persist nonetheless. There's an example that I like from the founding of a company that you may have heard of. It started as a little gaming startup. In the 2010s in San Francisco, they were creating this online multiplayer game that was about collaboration. It was called Glitch. And the startup Tiny Speck was on paper doing really, really well. They had raised tens of millions of dollars. Their launch was covered by the New York Times. They had tens of thousands of active players from the very beginning. And yet the founder felt in his heart of hearts that there was something wrong, that they weren't quite on the right path. And so he did something that from the outside might be seen as crazy. He decided to shut the company down while they still had millions of dollars in the bank. He made his investors whole. He said all of his employees that wanted to leave could leave. And then with the team that was left, he built a new company, an entire different industry around this communication tool that they had built to communicate internally. And that company that he built is called Slack, which you might be familiar with. The founder is Stuart Butterfield. And he said in some of the interviews, when we decided to make that huge pivot, we didn't know where we were going. We didn't know whether there was necessarily an audience or a market, but he had the faith and the conviction to take this bet, and it turned into one of the most successful B2B companies in the world. The fact that it sold for $27 billion to Salesforce is a nice sort of bow on the end of the case study, but I think the real wisdom is that Butterfield was willing to not see uncertainty as a problem to be solved or a threat, but to see it as where his beautiful new idea could stem from.
Wow, it's so interesting. I mean, there are countless examples historically. Like Henry Ford famously said, if he would have asked people what they had wanted at the time, they would have said a faster horse. And he went on to create the car, which is obviously, architected the world in such a profound way. I also feel like as a creative, your old work should make you cringe. Is that something that you would agree with? I mean, maybe it's not going to make other people cringe. Like I actually enjoy watching my own work, like consuming my own work, because I learn from it when it's like recent. But I have a real block when it comes to watching my older work, because I just feel like part of what it means to me to be a creator, to be a science communicator, is like I want to continually be getting better. And over a long enough time scale, like your really old work should actually make you cringe if you've grown, if you've gotten better at what it is that you do.
Yeah, and to take that one step further, I think the most innovative creators are people who are able to continue to reinvent themselves, to not make every album feel derivative of the last one, but actually to think, okay, who am I today? How can I bring new voice and a new perspective into this work? So going back to Brian Eno, he produced David Byrne, David Bowie, all of these really famous musicians, and he would do something in the recording studios, which I thought was brilliant. He would bring in these cards that he called, I think it's object creativity cards, where each card would have a constraint, a prompt that he would give to the musician. And it would say something like, delete the most important part of the song, try it backwards, make it something that is forward and turn it upside down. And by giving the musicians these constraints, they were able to produce things that were truly original. And I think that is the sign of a great creative, not someone who can just continue to go back to the same formula, but who is able to continually be on that steep part of the learning curve and reinvent themselves over time.
It's amazing. What are 2 to 3 ways that people listening to this today can do to increase their tolerance for uncertainty?
I think the first thing that I'd say is to separate what you can and you can't control. There is a Stoic philosopher named Epictetus that I think back to a lot. He wrote this manual for ethical living. And the first paragraph of the manual is basically separate everything in your life into that which you can control and that which you can't control. And from the latter, withdraw your energy and effort and give it to the former. I think for so much of the uncertain world, whether you're uncertain about climate change or you're uncertain about what your career is going to be in 5 years, we put so much effort into things that we fundamentally can't control. And so by separating those two things, I think that's a great first step. The second thing I'd say is to build to learn. So rather than think that you need a 10-year plan to start a business or to start a podcast or to try out that side project, are there ways that you can prototype it in a small experiment by putting yourself out into the world that will teach you what you hope to learn even faster? If you wait till you're ready, you're probably already too late. And it's by building to learn, by prototyping, that exposes you to the uncertainty, that gives you more clarity and conviction that can motivate you moving forward. And then the last part I'll say is you have to trust in your future self to be able to solve your future problems. I'll tell just a quick anecdote about a friend of mine named Emily. She's a therapist, but before she became a mental health professional, she was with her mom when she was given a terminal breast cancer diagnosis. And Emily was in her early 20s, and she was really struggling to cope. She'd spend week after week by her mom's side, and she was riding this sort of roller coaster of anticipatory grief and fear of what was to come. And one day in the hospital, one of their family friends, Bill, who's an oncology doctor, came to visit. And Bill asked Emily, Emily, how are you doing? And she said, honestly, Bill, I'm not doing very well. I don't know how I'll be able to handle it if my mom dies. And Bill said, the version of yourself that will handle that tragic event, if and when it occurs, will be born into existence in that moment. And that version of you will have more information, more context, and be better equipped to handle it than the version of you today. You have to trust in your future self to be able to solve your future problems. And I love that piece of wisdom, because I think so often when faced with uncertainty, we rush out to meet our worry. We think about everything that can go wrong, as opposed to just trying to be present and focused on the next right action, taking it one step at a time. And Emily is so glad that she didn't spend too much time dwelling in that dark place, because her mom ended up recovering. And, I know this is a very personal topic to some people, but even if, unfortunately her mom did pass away, I know you have experience with this personally too, worrying about what will happen in that moment only heightens our anxiety and brings us out of the present moment. But if you're able to trust in your future self to be able to solve some of your future problems, you can go back to the beginning of what I suggested, which is focusing on what you can control today, as opposed to trying to influence some future outcome that you have no power to control.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, there's power in the phrase, we'll cross that bridge when we get there.
Mm-hmm.
Would you say that this is can be a helpful heuristic when it comes to making decisions that you have to make when the time comes and you actually have to make a decision, but you don't have enough information? What do you do then?
Totally. I think that is the majority of the decisions we make. If we wait till we have perfect information, we often are too late in deciding. I'm thinking specifically about this one moment in my life when I was deciding between two jobs. And one was to continue working as a journalist at a trendy magazine. Another was to work as a designer at a design agency. And I couldn't make up my mind for the life of me. I was insufferable. I talked to everyone I could about it, my Uber driver, my yoga teacher, every friend of mine. And I realized, thinking back to that moment, I was looking for certainty where there was no certainty to be found. I thought that if I just banged my head against the wall at the right angle, I would know which job was the right job for me. But I didn't recognize that what made that decision difficult is that there was no one right answer. One job was better for some reasons, another job was better for other reasons, and no job was better overall. That's what makes a hard choice, is that there are trade-offs. And so to live is to be able to make decisions in spite of uncertainty. There's this quote from this psychologist Rollo May that I like, which is, "Commitment is healthiest not in the absence of doubt, but in spite of doubt." The doubt, the uncertainty, is what gives us an opportunity to refine our character, to make choices in spite of not knowing how they are going to turn out.
Well, what kind of homework can we do to ensure at the very least that we're stacking the odds in our favor?
Yeah, I like to start with a bit of a decision tree. And the first decision is, do you have the power to influence the outcome? So there's a lot of research in my book about people facing uncertain moments, whether it's getting a medical biopsy but not knowing the diagnosis, or taking the bar exam and not knowing whether you passed. And I think in those moments, if you can do something to control the outcome, you should do that thing. But in the majority of cases, you can't do anything to control the outcome, especially in these sort of acute moments of uncertainty. The next sort of bifurcation of the decision tree is, can you prepare for multiple potential situations? So, for example, there's a study I quote in my book about breast cancer. And often for women, the hardest part of the breast cancer journey is that period when you get a biopsy, but you don't know what your diagnosis is. More stressful than chemo, than the surgeries, and all of these other things that you might expect to be the harder parts of the journey. It's that acute uncertainty, and maybe some of our listeners have dealt with some of that before in their own life and their health. If you can't do anything to influence the outcome, can you prepare for multiple different outcomes? Which is to say, if I do have cancer, do I know what my insurance is? Do I know how my kid will get to school? Do I know what support system I might be able to set up? And by doing that contingency planning, you're able to be better equipped for multiple potential scenarios, as opposed to just staking all of your identity or well-being on one particular decision. And then one layer down, if you've done what you can to influence the outcome, if you've done what you can to prepare for multiple potential outcomes, the last thing is really just about regulating your nervous system. How can you accept what you can't control and be able to cope through that moment? So there's some really interesting research about flow states, for example. If you're able to find activities that challenge you to a sufficient amount that you can really be lost in the moment of doing those activities, it makes those acute waiting periods much easier. There's really interesting research about ways to regulate your nervous system through, say, breath work or yoga that actually allows you to go from this fight, flight, or freeze response into this more expansive place where you're literally able to see more possibilities, when you're able to sort of back away from that threat of, oh my God, uncertainty could be life or death. You're able to see other things that might exist in your frame of reference. And so that's what I'd say. I'd say, separate what you can and can't control, prepare for multiple different scenarios, and then do what you can to accept the uncertainty that's inevitable in any part of life of making a decision.
Wow, it's so cool. I mean, it mirrors so well what I went through when about a year ago, just over a year ago, I underwent spine surgery. And there was so much uncertainty about how the procedure was going to go. I mean, it was like a relatively niche procedure. I had artificial disc replacement at L5S1, and it's like the surgery is a big deal. I mean, they go in through the front. You're getting this like prosthetic device in your spine. The standard of care typically, historically, has been fusion for intractable back pain. But I found like this small cadre of spine surgeons who were implementing this new motion preserving device. But like I had no idea how the procedure was going to like turn out. I was like, making sure that I had all my like affairs in order, just in case of a worst possible scenario. But I did a lot of what you're describing. I just like innately, I feel like I did. I mean, I was still terrified going into it. Like I remember when they were wheeling me into the OR, I was still like, I felt like even in that moment, pulling the plug, like ripping all the things out of my arms and running out of there. But I spoke to I did as much information gathering as I possibly could without driving myself crazy. I spoke to as many experts as possible. I did as much research as I could. I spoke to, non-experts, but like people who had anecdotal experience with it. So I was like gathering as much data as I could, still nervous, still worried, still plenty of uncertainty. But at the end of the day, I decided to go through with it based on this, the information that I had accumulated. And, and knock on wood, I'm very grateful it ended up being like the right outcome.
Totally. But even after that point where you've done all your homework, you've done all of your preparation, you've listened to all of the doctor's guidelines, there's still a gap. And what I like to think about is that trust is an active engagement with that unknown. You have to, at a certain point, do all that you can. There might be diminishing returns at some point of gathering even more information. And then you have to make choices in spite of risk. There's no elimination of uncertainty or elimination of risk in lots of the decisions we make. It's just a matter of how we're able to handle it and persist.
Yeah, it's so true. How much of what you write about in this book is based on like scientific literature? I don't know the extent to which there is literature on this topic. And then just speaking to people who have, in the midst of difficult decisions.
Yeah, it's a good balance of both. The book itself is narrative driven. So there's 10 chapters. Each chapter is a narrative story about someone dealing with uncertainty. So for example, there's a chapter about a couple that's deciding whether or not they want to get divorced. And they're out having a drink at a bar in New York City, and they decide to do something kind of crazy, which is they say, okay, for a year, we're not going to talk to each other at all. We're going to go our separate ways. And then we're going to meet back at this bar in a year and decide whether or not we want to stay together or not. So there are these sort of like interesting case studies about uncertainty. There's another one about a country in the Pacific where the average height of the country is 9 feet above sea level. It's called Tuvalu. And the estimates are that by 2050, half of the country will be underwater. So it's a question of, what should they do today? Do you stay or do you go? So there's these sort of narrative approaches. And then there's a lot of different academic research from the economists, from the psychologists. There's some philosophy. One of my favorite studies that I quote in the introduction is that there was a study where participants were either given a 50% chance of receiving this very painful electric shock or an 100% chance of receiving a very painful electric shock. And you'd think that the people that were certainly going to get the bad thing would be more stressed out. And the opposite was found to be true. We would somehow rather a certain bad thing happen to us than have to cope with the uncertainty of not knowing. And there's many different studies that back this up. One shows that job uncertainty, so not knowing whether you're going to be laid off or not, can take a similar toll on your health as actually losing your job. Uncertainty is one of the things as humans we are wired to be so uncomfortable for. So the book is sort of my attempt to give you a guide of how to get better at dealing with what you don't know, whether that's in your business, your personal life, or your relationships.
What specifically inspired you to write it?
Well, part of it is, as you know, as an author yourself, we write the books that we need to read. And I am a naturally indecisive person. I love playing my own devil's advocate. I love gathering as much information, or like that job indecision question I had, trying to find the right answer by just uncovering every single rock. And the thing that I have come to realize over time is that uncertainty is not a problem to be solved. It's not something that if we just have the right formula or protocol, we can banish from our life. But actually, it's something that gives our life texture. It creates serendipity and surprise and delight. And so rather than just looking at uncertainty as a threat, we can choose curiosity over fear. We can choose to see uncertainty as the birthplace of possibility. And I wrote it for myself and for anyone else who wants to get better at dealing with what they don't know.
Amazing. Is there ever a situation where having more information could make us worse decision makers?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and not just worse decision makers, but we sometimes can self-sabotage because getting more information might make us more in our head. For example, there's like a really famous study about this AIDS clinic in Mexico City where all of these patients would get tested for AIDS and then not actually get their results. They wouldn't come back to the clinic even though they've already gone through all of the testing because their fear around what those results might be might drive them to ruminate. Or, for example, the screening for, I think it's pancreatic cancer, or no, I think it's prostate cancer. It's very common for men of a certain age to develop prostate cancer at some point. And there's this interesting new movement that actually shows that maybe it doesn't make sense to get tested for prostate cancer if you're above a certain age, because the potential negative effects of gathering that new information might outweigh the positive effects of having that information, because you can potentially live with prostate cancer for 20, 30 years, or lots of men die with it, for example. And so there's a whole field of study of when gathering more information actually creates more harm than good. I do think that in general, knowledge is power, and particularly with things like your health, it's really important that you do your research. But I do also believe that there is a way of gathering information as a proxy for having control over a situation that at some level you need to be able to give up control and accept the lack of control that you might have over your own future.
Wow. I'm definitely a control freak.
Yeah.
When it comes to like my creative and like professional output, it can sometimes drive the people in my life crazy, but I feel like it's kind of like what you were describing before. Like there are definitely areas in life where I'm more comfortable ceding control, but then that I think gives me the peace of mind to be more controlling in other domains. And also because, I don't know, like I just feel like if it's something that I'm, like my work feels like my children in a way. Like every podcast episode, every newsletter that I send out, like every book that I've written, like I just feel like, intensely guarded about that work.
Yeah, but if you tried to control too much, you would never hit publish.
Yeah.
You would never risk exposure. In the book, I talk about these 3 different certainty traps, these things that keep us trapped in our certainty. And the first is comfort, the desire to stay comfortable. I'm sure we all have a friend who's in a job or in a relationship that they know isn't right for them, but their fear of change is keeping them stuck in the situation that isn't working. And the second certainty trap I talk about is hubris, our thought that we know best. And I think that's particularly true in the health and wellness space. A lot of hubristic thinking can keep people from actually listening to experts or doing the research or empowering themselves with knowledge or being able to admit what they don't know. And the third is control, we just talked about, which is the desire to be able to plan every single outcome of your life. And I don't think there's any better example of our lack of control than our mortality. We all are going to die. That's maybe the one certainty that we all share. And yet, not knowing how or when we're going to die is this incredible practice of not knowing, of being able to deal with uncertainty. And so I try and talk about the virtues on the other side of these different traps. So rather than control, we can accept our situations. Rather than be hubristic, we can be humble. And rather than being comfortable all the time, we can look to grow or to learn.
What about the tragedy of the golden handcuffs? I mean, I feel like you've written a book about work.
Yeah.
And, I have, there's somebody who I'm close to in my life. I mean, they have a corporate job that they hate, but it provides a sense of security, certainty for them because they have that salary, when they'd rather be doing anything but finding obviously something that they're more passionate about, or at least passionate about. But golden handcuffs, I think for so many people, it provides this kind of like Novocaine.
Totally. It's the devil,
Yeah.
The most popular New York Times op-ed of the last 20 years was written by this philosopher named Alain de Botton.
I love him.
And I'll never forget the headline. It says, "Why You'll Marry the Wrong Person." And it's a little bit of like a clickbaity, tongue-in-cheek headline. But his basic argument was, rather than just think about the reasons that our suitors or potential romantic partners are amazing, we should also wonder in what ways they are crazy or in what ways they are broken. Because when you decide to marry someone or be with someone, you get the full package. You don't just get, the party animal on Saturday night or the amazing chef. You also get, their family baggage and how they show up when they're underslept. And so we should also be thinking about the trade-offs and the people that we're with. I think it's a great analogy for the working world. So often when we think about potential job paths, we just think about the potential upside. So if you're a friend in corporate with the golden handcuffs, maybe it pays fairly well. Maybe it allows them to support, their family members, and the cost is the bureaucracy or the meetings that should have been emails. But even in our path, like we both work for ourselves, we're solopreneurs, but there are trade-offs on this path as well. It's easy to see the grass is greener, but I miss being part of a team that's larger than myself. I miss having an office to go to sometimes. I miss having a mission that's larger than just the next book that I want to write. And so it's really easy for someone in a corporate job to romanticize the path of a creator. And sometimes, I'll be honest, even though I am a full-time author and I work for myself, I romanticize, having that corporate job that numbers just show up in your bank account every 2 weeks. And so I think understanding the trade-offs is the important part of any decision, whether it's about your career or about your relationships. There's often downsides and upsides to any potential path. And the quicker we can move on from this idea that there is one right path or one right partner or one right job, it can free us to make any path or partner or job right.
Yeah, there's that tendency for the grass to appear perennially greener on the other side. But I'll be the first to say that being a solopreneur, it's not a walk in the park. Like, I love what I do. I wouldn't have it any other way. But you get haters, you get, critics. It's like, it's insane. I can imagine where most people, or at least many people wouldn't have the stomach for that.
Yeah.
But that's not what you see on social media, right? When you see the follower count or the engagement or the accolades, like, at the end of the day, social media is a highlight reel. But it's not all like roses working for yourself.
It's really easy to compare your insides with other people's outsides. It's really easy to see all of the shiny things that people post on their highlight reels or share on LinkedIn or share at the Thanksgiving table. But you don't know what the internal experience is of these individuals. My first book was all about work and how people who might be quote unquote successful might be unhealthy or unhappy or not actually as fulfilled as they are perceived. I talked to so many people who achieved their goals, whether it was to enter the C-suite or to make 7 figures, only to arrive at that moment and say, is this it? What's left? And the main sort of prescriptive advice of my first book, The Good Enough Job, was about the value of diversifying your identity, to see work as part of, but not the entirety of who you are, and to be able to invest in other facets of who you are as well. And I think that piece of advice is also a great piece of advice with dealing with uncertainty. If your whole identity and self-worth is tied to your job or your ability to be a parent or your follower count on Instagram, that's an incredibly risky proposition. The world is precarious and subject to more and more rapid change. And so rather than just thinking about one facet of who you are as being all of who you are, you can build a more broad foundation that'll allow you to be more resilient in spite of all the slings and arrows of the future.
Like an intrinsic sense of meaning?
Intrinsic sense of meaning, also just multiple sources of meaning. I don't think there's anything wrong with loving what you do or identifying with what you do, so as long as it's not the only thing that you find meaning from or that you find identity from in your life.
Yeah, where else do you find meaning?
I think part for me is definitely from my sort of exercise. So I play on an ultimate frisbee team. I am learning how to be a salsa dancer with my wife.
Cool.
And it's nice to do these things where people couldn't care less about how many books I've sold or how many words I've written that week. It's like another container for how I show up in the world. That's a different value system. I think part of it is through relationships. So being a present father and partner and son and brother and making sure that my values are reflected in how I spend my time. One of my favorite professors used to say, show me your calendar and I'll show you what you value. And making sure there is time and energy that's being invested in these different identities or sources of meaning that we hope to cultivate. I don't think it has to be these grand gestures. I interviewed this psychologist for my first book, and she works with a lot of type A, very highly ambitious people. And she'd tell them about investing in aspects of their life beyond work. And they say, okay, I'm going to run an Ironman. I'm going to read 52 books this year. And in some ways, they're quantifying their leisure. They're turning their leisure into another form of labor. I don't think it has to be a big gesture. It can be something small, like practicing piano for 10 minutes after dinner or going on a weekly walk with your best friend, but something to remind yourself that you exist on this earth to do more than just produce economic value.
Well, what about for people who feel that they just don't have the time of the day to embrace other, activities, passions?
To be honest, I don't really buy it. I think sure, there are people who have very demanding jobs, and there's probably a very small subset who may literally not have time of the day. Maybe you're in residency to be a surgeon, or maybe you're Elon Musk or whatever. But in order to cultivate other sources of meaning, it doesn't require a ton of time. It can be reading 10 pages of a book of fiction. It can be trying to learn a new language. It can be making sure that you call your parents on your drive to and from work. Just making sure that you're making an active choice to show up in the world as more than just your job or more than just some external quantifiable metric for your worth.
Yeah, I do that. I feel like I do that fairly regularly. I try to make time in my day for that which I'm passionate about beyond like fitness and nutrition. Fitness makes up a big part of my life. Like my viewers, listeners know that over the past couple of years, I've been really engaged with like fitness and as an enthusiast, like bodybuilding and body composition. But yeah, I try to make time in my day for, music, whether it's listening to like the latest drop from one of my favorite musicians. I'm friends with musicians, and I try to carve out, time in my calendar to, if I'm able to accompany them on tours, which I've been really lucky to get invited to go on. I spend as much time as I can with family. I love playing with my cat. I read as much as I can outside of the domain of, of like health and fitness and nutrition, even though it's like that's probably 90% of what it is that I read about. I think it's crucially important. It's also like a pressure release valve from the stresses that come up inevitably with work.
Totally. If you're rising and falling just based on your professional accomplishments, it's really easy for that to spill over to all other facets of your life too. If your boss says something really disparaging, or if you don't hit that quarterly sales goal, you might think that it's a reflection of your self-worth. But if you've bolstered your identity, if you've invested in these different parts of who you are, it not only helps you recharge and so you can be more productive when you're back on the clock per se, but it allows you just to have a more broad perspective on what it means to live a rich, meaningful life. And all of us will, at some point, not have our jobs to rely on. I've talked to a lot of recent retirees who are going through this sort of crisis of meaning, and because they haven't cultivated these other hobbies or interests or facets of who they are left wondering, if I don't have my job, who am I? It's a lesson that some people had to learn the hard way during the pandemic, where they might have thought of themselves as a Googler, or thought of themselves as having sort of a lifelong loyalty or fealty from their employer, only to be unceremoniously let go. And I think that is a great realization for some, even though it can be really hard in the moment to see the importance of diversifying who you are.
Yeah, and there's a silver lining. Like, one of my favorite lines, I think it's Ursula Le Guin. One does not discover new lands without consenting to lose sight of the shore for a very long time. Like, you won't discover new lands unless you take that leap of faith.
Yeah, there's a metaphor that I really like, which is to be a leader in the face of uncertainty is like sitting in a rowboat on a lake that's shrouded in heavy fog. You might not be able to see very far in front of you. You might not be able to know exactly where you'll end up, but you have two jobs. The first is to have faith that eventually you'll reach land. Remember, you're on a lake. And the second is to keep rowing. And I think that is the key. Action absorbs anxiety. If you're able to keep moving, to keep persisting in spite of uncertainty, that's where the clarity will emerge.
Made me think of the end of Tommy Boy. You ever see that movie?
I haven't, no.
You haven't seen Tommy? It's one of the greatest comedies.
I know, I'm a 90s kid.
Of all time. David Spade, Chris Farley, rest in peace. What about when it comes to information gathering? I mean, like, the glut of information today is just overwhelming, to say the least. I mean, now, thanks to AI, I feel like we probably create more information every day than we have over the span of decades in the not too distant past. So, now in a time where everybody's vying for eyeballs, for attention, the expert economy, the coaching economy, like, there's information overwhelm. So what do we do about that?
I'm thinking about a few weeks ago, I was feeling really addicted to my phone. And rather than put my phone down or create some boundaries around my phone use, I decided to read an entire book about phone addiction. And this isn't to say that you shouldn't gather information or it's not important to be informed. But I think sometimes we use information gathering as a proxy toward reaching our goals, when in fact it is a distraction from taking the action that we actually know needs to be taken. And it comes back to our desire for control. Rather than starting a business, I can just listen to a bunch of podcasts about entrepreneurship. Rather than writing a book, I can just, read about writing or follow writers on Instagram. At a certain point, the rubber has to meet the road. This isn't to say that you shouldn't do any research or you shouldn't gather any information, but you need to be able to test your ideas in the real world. I used to work at this design firm called IDEO, and we used to have this saying that you should never come to a meeting without a prototype. Now, a prototype doesn't have to be, something with software that takes weeks to create, but it can be just something small to make your idea tangible, and that can actually be the fastest way to learn. I was once working on this project where we were designing a new vacuum cleaner for Dyson, the vacuum cleaner company. And in the research phase, the researcher went into people's homes and took a toilet or a paper towel roll, the center of a paper towel roll, and a Kleenex box, and taped the Kleenex box to the paper towel roll and gave it to these different research participants and said, okay, imagine this was a vacuum cleaner. How would you use it? And then afterwards, after the experiment, we asked the participants, how did it feel when we gave you this, paper prototype? And they said, it felt like you guys could really use my help. And by testing something in the market, by giving something to someone that was tangible, we learned way faster than we would have if we had spent, weeks and weeks just by ourselves in the room trying to be smart people without actually talking to customers. And I think that mentality of lo-fi, time-bound experiments can be applied to so many different facets of life.
It's so true. You know, as you were talking, it made me think of how analogous, like our information environment has become to our food environment. You know, we're inundated with constant access to minimally satiating, ultra processed foods that provide little in the way of actual nutrition. And as a result, I mean, that's part of the milieu that makes them so easy to overconsume. And it's kind of similar, I guess, like just the information environment that we're all tasked with coping with today. It's like the information has become so low signal to noise that it's become in a way like minimally satiating. So I feel like it compels the average person to just seek out more and more and more information. It's just like more and more and more content, right? But like the actual signal to noise value is so low that it's not satiating in the same way that ultra processed foods aren't satiating and drive their own overconsumption.
Totally. And yet we think because the content or the foods have been engineered to perfectly hit our taste buds that they will ultimately be satiating, or we're just one video away from finding that golden nugget of wisdom. But, you know, I can scroll my phone for hours and not be able to remember anything that I learned, quote unquote. And I think that's part of the promise of social media that is really a trap, which is that if you just follow the right people or you just click on the right, you know, link or tweet, then you'll find that life-changing piece of information. And there is some wisdom. There is some maybe diluted things that you can get from a 60-second video, but it's not the same as digging your teeth into a book or actually trying to do something in the real world. Like, for example, I'm a writer. All the time I get DMs from people that say, hey, like, I want to write a book. I want to, you know, get published in the New York Times. What advice do you have for me? And the first question I always ask is, what have you written recently? Like, what do you like writing? And almost without fail, the response I get is, well, I haven't actually written anything, but I have all of these ideas. And the truth is, like, if you want to get better at writing, you have to write. You know, there's nothing that is a good stand-in for the experience of actually doing the work, of getting proximate to the work that you hope to do. It's, I think, true about our careers too. If you're curious about exploring these different careers, is there a way that you can prototype it yourself? If you want to become a podcaster, can you create that low fidelity version of a podcast, not wait till you have the perfect mic and the perfect camera and the perfect studio, but actually get proximate to the work so you can figure out whether you like the actual process of doing the work or just the ends.
It's so true. Like, I was having this conversation with another author recently that we were talking about what an incredible tool AI is, but also in tandem with that, how grateful we both were for having been writers prior to the advent and the ubiquity of AI. You know, having raw dogged 3 books pre-AI, I mean, you get to see, like, it makes you so easily able to recognize, A, what a powerful tool and friction reducer AI can be for creatives, but on the other side of the coin, how banal its own writing is and how great it is to be able to have the skill as a writer to then go and wield those tools.
I think a good analogy is actually smartphones. Like, we are part of the generation who knew life before smartphones and know life after smartphones. Like, we know what it is to write before Claude, and now hopefully that friction has helped us have more discernment and taste. So even if we are collaborating with these tools, we have spent years actually building our cognitive fitness to a point where we know what good looks like.
It's so true. If somebody listening to this today feels stuck in a period of uncertainty, what would you tell them?
The first thing I'll say is try to expose yourself to uncertainty in a way that is different from the problem that you are trying to tackle. I think often when we're faced with these intractable problems, like, should I marry this person or should I take this job? We get stuck in these ruminative states where we're just turning over the same thoughts and ideas again and again and again. Changing your state, whether that's like your physical state, like where you are, or your emotional state by exposing yourself to a new situation. It can be as small as striking up a conversation with a stranger, can help you make progress in an unrelated, intractable problem in your life. And then the second thing I'll say is that trust in your ability to adapt and course correct in the future. I think we so often discount our ability to change. There's this thing called the end of history illusion, where we can think back to our past and recognize all of the times that we've changed, but we project into the future and we think we're going to be like who we are today forever. And the truth is, whether it's a job decision or a romantic situation, you can often change course after you've placed that bet or gone on that date or accepted that job more than you give yourself credit for. Hopefully that lowers the stakes and helps you understand that making decisions to live in this world is about making decisions in spite of uncertainty, not in the absence of uncertainty.
Wow. Simone, fascinating stuff, man. Thanks for coming out. Thanks for writing this book. We are in tumultuous times, and we are faced with an overwhelming glut of information. I mean, even for somebody who is, I think fairly adept at knowing how to sift through information, it can feel at times daunting. But I'm so glad that you've put out this tome for us. I've got one last question for you, but before we get to that, where can people pick up the new book, and how can they find you on social media?
Yeah, the book is called How to Not Know. The best way is just to go to howtonotknow.com or anywhere you get your books. All of my socials are there. And I really do think it's a book where I've been the beneficiary of it, the book arriving at the right time. It does feel like uncertainty is in the water that we're all swimming in these days. And my goal is to hopefully give you a guide to get more comfortable with uncertainty yourself.
Hell yeah, love it. Well, the last question I guys ask to everybody on the show, what does living a genius life mean to you?
I think for me, it's alignment between how I spend my time and how I want to be spending my time. That's always been the metric that matters most when it comes to work or spending time with my loved ones. If I have the Venn diagram that looks most like a circle, that's what being a genius means to me.
Amen. Love it. We've never gotten that answer before. Beautifully put. Well, thanks for coming out.
Thanks for having me.
Fascinating conversation. Thank you guys for listening. Share this episode with friends and loved ones that you think may benefit from it. And remember, guys, chaos isn't a pit. It's a ladder. I'll catch you on the next episode. Peace. Hey, if you liked that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.